Morning.
Morning.
We're going to be in Revelation chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2 this morning. We're going to be going verse by verse like we've been doing. And we're going to start up in verse 12. Now, last week when I was here with you, we started chapter 2 and we talked about Ephesus and we talked about Smyrna. So we covered two of those. We went verse by verse. We're going to jump right into it this morning. So what do we remember about our cultural study on the church that was located in Pergamum, or the city itself? I know when we talk about the church in Pergamum or Ephesus, whatever, we kind of generalize and we like to look at the entire city, its culture. What was the pagan religion there? What did they worship most? And we've uncovered a lot. And so now that we're going verse by verse, if I do go over something and you're like, well, wait a minute, where did he get that? It's okay to stop me and just ask, okay? So we're going to get right into it here. So what do we remember? The city and the entire region was given over to the Romans in 133 BC. You see, when the Romans were coming to this part of the world, they had already conquered basically everything to the west of the region of what now is modern-day Turkey, and they also had conquered everything east and south of that. So there was this just one piece of land that they needed to connect the entire Roman Empire. And so they really needed this piece of real estate, some would say. And so King Attalus III of the Lydian Empire is dying from sickness. And he knows he's dying, and so he writes in his will that upon his death, that the entire Lydian kingdom, everything that the Lydian Empire owned, everything, even the king's titles, would all go to the Roman Empire. That was a big deal. That was actually a major deal for the Romans. I mean, they were just handed this piece of real estate as a gift, basically. So that happened in 133 BC. Now, when King Attalus III did pass, the Romans didn't really go in just yet, because they thought, this is kind of weird. I mean, would you not think that too, that an entire kingdom was willing to just give up everything? So the Romans didn't make a move at first. Well, then, when King Attalus III's uncle started to make a power play, and he wanted to wear the crown of the Lydian kingdom, the Romans reacted quickly. They said, whoa, we got to go in there before they seize power again. And so the Romans go in, they conquer, and it avoids a lot of bloodshed. And so some argue as to why King Attalus III did what he did. Some say it was just to avoid civil war. He did not have a proper heir to the throne, and so he knew what was inevitable. Either civil war was going to take place, or the entire nation was just going to be in shambles. So he kind of weighed the two options and said, hey, let's just give it to the Romans, okay? General population of the city of Pergamum was about 100,000 in John's day. The city was the capital of the Lydian Empire. It was the governmental seat. It was the Washington, D.C. of the Lydian Empire. And it also becomes the eastern capital for the Roman Empire. To the west you had Rome, obviously. To the east you had Pergamum. Augustus, the son of Julius Caesar, the adopted son, chose Pergamum as his Neokoros. In other words, that was the city that his rule would mirror. Domitian chose Ephesus. We talked about that. That's where he chose to build this huge gymnasium, which was not like a gym like you think. It was a university. But also in combination was a temple. And it was where all the gods were holding up Domitian in his temple. We talked about that in our culture study. The city was home to lots of temples, including several to the emperors, because imperial worship was big here. It's still debated as to who the patron god was. We talked about in every single city that they had a patron god, one that they dedicated most of their worship to. You remember with Ephesus, it was who? The largest temple to her was built in Ephesus. Dionysus. You said Artemis? Yeah, Artemis. I thought I heard it. I was just making sure. Yeah, Artemis. Well, here it's debated. There are three possibilities. and for good reason. One is that it was Athena. That's actually the number one most popular you will see if you were to just Google search who was the patron god of Pergamum. Athena. The second largest library to her temple, library/temple, was built for her here. The first one was in Athens, Athena. Zeus, that's the second most popular, Zeus, because the largest altar ever constructed to Zeus was built here. And I've got the measurements up there for you. And then there was Asclepius. And you remember we talked about the healthcare of the Roman Empire and how they would operate that. And here in Pergamum was the largest hospital/temple to Asclepius, and it was called the Asclepion, right? I-O-N at the end, Asclepion. And that is where you would go if you could not get proper treatment anywhere else. This was where you went. This was the biggest hospital/temple. So it's debated, but the most famous of these were the hospital and the altar of Zeus. Us gladi was practiced here. That's a Latin term. Basically, it gave the governor of Pergamum basically any kind of capital punishment power you can imagine, just as the emperor himself were there. So the governor of this city in particular was allowed to take the life of anyone else with the sword, with the Roman double-edged sword, just as if the emperor himself was making the call. And then, of course, we see that this is the place where Satan's throne is, or Satan's throne dwells. It says that in the text. It does not say that to any of the other churches. So we're going verse by verse here. Let's put it into context. Verse 12. And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this. What an amazing way for Jesus to start his statement for the Christians living in the one city in this region where the governor had full power and authority of the emperor to condemn anyone via the sword. The double-edged sword, which was the Roman specialty on the battlefield. That was not just a coincidence that all this stuff lined up, okay? Again, like I said, Augustus, who was known to be the first Roman emperor of the Roman Empire, chose this city as his rule. Because it was easy to keep the city as a governmental power, that is why it stayed this way for the Romans. The Romans didn't just come in and tear all the governmental buildings down. No, they just added to the infrastructure. They just made it their own place. And so this city became a governmental seat to the east of Rome. I've seen where some people have even said that just as Satan's throne was in the west in Rome, in the east it was Pergamum, which does make sense when we look at it in that sense. But there's much debate as to why Satan's throne dwelling here is in reference to Pergamum. There's different ideas. So then we get to that verse. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. There are a lot of interesting takes as to what this could have been. We did talk about this in our culture study that ironically and very surprisingly, when they did all these archaeological digs and they've been doing all these uncoverings, they've discovered that a lot of the temples that existed in Pergamum, the altars to these specific gods, Dionysus, Asclepius, Zeus, all of these altars are shaped similarly to thrones. So, a throne represents what? Yeah, it represents rule. It represents authority. And so, you've got the throne-like altar of Zeus. Pergamum was also, like I said, the home of the cult of Asclepius, who was the god of healing and medicine. When you walked into the diagnostics room, when you got out of that tunnel, remember we talked about that? When they would go down in this tunnel and you would hear this rushing water as it streamed alongside you, and that was the sound of rushing water. And when you got to the other side, the priest basically believed that was Asclepius talking to you, diagnosing you, and basically calling for a treatment for the priest. So when you got to the other side, the priests seemed like they had it all figured out because they claimed that Asclepius was talking to them through the sound of that water and to you as you made your venture down that tunnel. And of course, Jesus claims that, we see many references that Jesus speaks how? What's the terminology that John will use to describe Jesus' voice? Sound of rushing water, right? Yep. Also, now when you got to the diagnostics room, you know what? You know what you got to see when you walked in there? Not only did you see patients lying on beds, and you saw priests, and you saw on the wall, remember we talked about all the plasters? They would plaster like basically clay made or pottery made legs and ears and faces and things like that to show you that Asclepius healed all these ailments of other people so he could heal you. He saved them so he could save you. And of course, Jesus would strike down Asclepius in that belief system, when he talks about this. But anyway, when you walked in that room, you would have seen this large throne, and Asclepius is sitting on that throne. So that was pretty common. And of course, there is connection with Pergamum being the source of the emperor cult. That is where that worship derived from. That's where it kind of started. And so the city had several emperor temples built in its day. Moving on with verse 13. You hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, who was my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. So again, we see that reference. Compromise was a big deal in Pergamum. And it seemed like the church here in Pergamum, and several of the others as well, were having a really hard time not mingling or trying to stay out of the pagan rituals and practices that the Greco-Roman religion had available. It was easier for a Christian to say, well, hey, I'm going to worship God, I'm going to also worship the emperor, and I'm also going to worship Zeus or these other gods. But as Christians, as people of God, we know that's not available. We can't do that. We literally got a foot in every single door here. We can't do that. Jesus makes it clear we can't do that. A bunch of other texts says we can't do that. But yet, it was easier for them to compromise. Why is that? Why was it easier for them to compromise?
Well, it's challenging to continue to work and provide for your family. And not,
Yes.
give in to lip service to something else. That's part of it.
You're right. We talked about that. We talked about how a lot of these cities, they had labor guilds. If you were not part of these labor guilds, chances are you were going to be more isolated in your trade. You were not going to make as much money that way. And so really putting yourself out there as a Christian and as someone who didn't want to mingle in those other practices, it put crosshairs on you, really. It made you a target. And as the Roman emperors, really with, even before Nero, but definitely with Nero, if you had a target on your back, Nero made it a point, or a lot of these emperors made it a point to chase you down, to hunt you down. And so it was just easier for them to compromise because it made them less of a target. And as Lovey said, it would have made things easier for them in that respect as well.
I think it's largely because of that. There was an ongoing debate in the early church, right, about the idea of, well, the flesh, it only matters what you believe.
Yes.
And the flesh didn't matter.
The Nicolaitans.
Yeah, the Nicolaitans.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, you're right. That's definitely a good form of that. That was sort of this offshoot. And so, yeah, you had a lot of that battling in these early churches with this specific thing. Now, Antipas, who was he? We read that verse and we've probably read it 100 times and we're like, there's a guy's name and that's really all we know. Well, Antipas is believed to have been an overseer of the church in Pergamum at one point in time in the first century. Obviously, he was martyred for his faith. The scripture, Jesus even calls him out as his faithful one, his witness. And the way that he was martyred was horrible. Obviously, as a Christian, there were many different ways that the Roman Empire would put you to death. The picture on the top there gives you one example, and sorry, I didn't know children would be. But in the top picture there, you see some imagery that's a little disturbing. But those things happened. Those things took place. There's no denying those things. I've even seen some History Channel where they some of them try to even downplay what was going on at that time. It was, all you got to do is dig in the historical writings and you can find just how horrible it would have been to be living in this time as a Christian and having that target on your back. Now the picture underneath that is a brazen bull. And a brazen bull was made to be an instrument of capital punishment. It was made to kill people. And what they would do is they would put the person in the hatch located at the top of the bull, and underneath the bull they would light a fire. And so just as you put a pan on a stove, you leave it on there for a while, you go to touch the pan, ow, right? Well, that's what it was, you being inside this bull, you would have died in that way. And then the way they designed the bull is they actually had this horn system that went through the nose and mouth of the bull and kind of made its way in all these little twists and turns. And by the time it got into the belly of the bull, if you were in pain and you were making that known, it would be transmitted out of the bull as bellows of a bull. So it would sound like a bull mooing or that low sound of a bull. Very horrific, very evil invention. I think any of us would agree with that. Horrible. But anyway, this was how Antipas was killed. Other historical writings confirm that this was how he was martyred. We already talked about Polycarp. He was the overseer in the church of Smyrna. He was executed, remember, in the arena. They tried to light the fire and the wind picked up, so they couldn't burn him, so they ended up they stabbed him. But the language that Jesus uses to describe Antipas, some would say personifies the steadfastness of some of them living there in Pergamum that were part of the church, because persecution was so rampant and so awful. Even though you had some people who were trying to compromise to avoid this, some were not. Some were choosing not to go this route, such as Antipas. And look at how Jesus really pulls him out of the picture and he says, look at him. Look to him for an example here. It's kind of what I see in this text. Okay, so here we go. So we're going to, kind of what Seth was talking about, compromise and how it was easier for them to compromise, and like the Nicolaitans, they're mentioned here. We'll talk about them in a second. But here it says, but I have a few things against you. Okay. So he says, because you have there some. So obviously it's not everybody. It's not the entirety of the body of believers in Pergamum that are having this issue. But there are some of you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of immorality. Okay, we got to go back. We got to go back to the Old Testament, because if we're going to read Revelation, we got to have two things. We got two keys, right? Two keys to unlock the interpretation here. What are they? Just don't. Old Testament. What else? What have we been playing on this whole time? We got Old Testament, the Tanakh, I guess would be a word there, and then what else? You got to have the cultural context, right? Because if you don't have one of these, then it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense. So, Numbers 22 through 24. You find the story of that prophet mentioned in that text, Balaam. And does anybody remember, and I know I've got the answers written all up above me here, but what was Balaam known for? Yeah, the talking dog. There you go. That's, yeah, instead of taking those in, yeah, definitely, I like that. But that's what he's most famously known for, is this talking donkey. Now, there was a purpose behind the talking donkey. There was a point. Wasn't it was just put in there for fun and for children to look at and go, oh, animals can talk. But anyway, so in Numbers 20 through 24, it was discovered that the Balak was the king of Moab. And he tried to conquer Israel, and he couldn't do it. Because no matter how many battles he would go up against Israel in open warfare, Israel stopped him. And he said, there's got to be a better way to destroy the Israelites. I've got to conquer them. And so he brings forth this prophet that was not a Jewish prophet. His name was Balaam. And he says, Balaam, tell me how. Basically, he wants this prophet to curse Israel. He obviously believes in this power that prophets have a certain ability to curse and to bless, which is interesting. That a pagan king like this knew this. And so, but God makes it to where Balaam can't. Is the gist of the story. He can't do it. God prevents it. But there's something that Balaam does towards the end of the story that gets him into trouble. Instead of cursing Israel, he provides advice. And he advises Balak, hey, if you want to really defeat Israel, you have to corrupt the nation from within. You're not going to fight them in the battlefield. You're going to have to fight them inwardly. So send your young, beautiful ladies, your young, beautiful women, to marry their young men. And over time, it'll take some time, but they'll pull these young men and their families away into these pagan practices of worshiping these other gods. And that is how you're going to demoralize and corrupt Israel. And then they'll be easy for the taking. And so by encouraging this behavior, he no doubt encourages not just immorality, but also idolatry. And everything that goes with it. And if there's one thing that we've looked at when we look at the Greco-Roman religion or any other pagan religion of the past, even all the way back to the Canaanites or the Phoenician kingdom, we see that there are two things that go hand in hand together with every form of pagan worship. And what were they? There was a sexual immorality, and eating food, fellowshipping, and eating food sacrificed to idols. It was all part of the ritualistic practices of worshiping these other gods. And those practices date back so far back, I don't even know what to tell you what year it started. It goes back that deep, that long time ago. Yeah, we're talking way back, way back. It wasn't just the Greco-Roman time of John, way back beyond that. And so this teaching lined up very well with what Seth was saying. He was saying, well, there was these offshoots in the church that were springing up. One was called the Nicolaitans, where they believed that their soul was good, their flesh was bad, so whatever they did with their flesh didn't matter with their soul. Well, that doesn't make any sense to us, does it? But to them, they were able to put logic to it, and that practice spread. And this church in Pergamum was not the only one dealing with this problem. Several others were as well. So both groups were literally trying to worship God, but also worship the Greco-Roman gods, or the emperor, or all the above. Unlike the church in Ephesus, who was commended for keeping false teachers away, Pergamum was not in that boat. Neither was Thyatira. Remember that from last week. Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. When the angel of God met Balaam on 3 separate occasions, he met Balaam with his sword drawn, ready to destroy. Balaam would eventually be killed by the sword by Moses and the Israelites at the end of Numbers 31. Jesus is making a call to the church. You need to do something about this, or I will handle it for you. This was the exact same type of language he speaks to the church in Thyatira, which was after this. So, I was about to say before this, after this. Verse 17, to him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, and a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. So first we see the promise of this hidden manna. What is the reference there to hidden manna? Why is it hidden? What's the reference to the Old Testament?
Falling from the sky.
It did fall in the sky. And they hid some of it somewhere. Why? What?
Ark.
Put in the Ark of the Covenant.
To remind them
Why?
about it. Why not?
Would somebody like to read Hebrews 9:4?
Having a golden altar and incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden jar holding manna and Aaron's rod, which was budded in the tablets of the covenant.
Would you call the manna that fell from heaven, how would the Hebrews in the wilderness look at that? What was the manna to them? Not when they were complaining about it.
What is
No. What was the purpose of this manna?
Sufficient.
Sustenance is what kept
To
them alive.
sustain them.
Sustain them for today.
Sustain them for the day, right? For the current moment. The bread of life. You have connection between the manna that is mentioned in the Tanakh, in the OT. But you do have reference to the bread of life in the NT. And who was it that claimed to be that? Who was it that claimed to be the bread of life? Jesus?
I'm the bread of life.
You have that promise with this white stone. Now it's interesting. And I never saw this in our cultural study. I was approaching it from the below there, where judges would often cast a black or white stone to declare guilt or innocence. Sometimes jurors would do this. Nobles would actually etch your name in a white stone, and that would be given out as party invitations. Basically, if you were going to a noble feast or a royal banquet, not like a birthday party, but like real formal events. But then the more I started digging, then I got really confused, and that's a problem. And so I started finding that some have even noted that this link to manna and the white stone kind of goes hand in hand together. And so when you look at the text in Exodus chapter 16, verse 31, he says, "And the house of Israel called the name thereof manna, and it was like coriander seed, white. And the taste of it was like wafers made with honey." And so I started looking these up, and that's what it looks like. They look like these little bitty balls. That's what they look like. They just look like little bitty stones, right? Whatever you want to call them, whatever you want to liken them as. And then Numbers 11:7, it also says the manna was this coriander seed, and the color thereof of bdellium. And so I just started getting really confused. But basically, it's like a white creamy color. So it's like, this all maybe has to do with manna, substance. And if you look at Jesus is the bread of life and we view manna as being the bread of life that sustained them in the wilderness, it really goes hand in hand at this point. That Jesus is going to give them what they need moment by moment as they need it. Okay. Thyatira. What do we remember about Thyatira? The city was founded as a military garrison originally. Over time, the city grew to a population of about 25,000 in John's day, which was pretty small. A lot of hard work was happening here in the city. The city was like a Pittsburgh. It was an industrial city of the region. You would have seen a lot of furnaces burning. You would have seen a lot of fabric dyers soaking clothing and other fabrics into dyes. Lydia, in Acts chapter 16, a convert to Jesus, she was from this city and she worked as a dyer of purple. Remember that, Acts 16. Burnished bronze or mirrored bronze was a popular export of the city as well as their purple dye. This will come to play in the text. Jesus will use this. The city wasn't very well protected. It had no acropolis. It had really no good geographical defenses. It actually sat in a valley. So, just all the ingredients to not being a very good spot. But that was just the spot where they built the city. And again, it was originally built as a military garrison. It was not meant to become this city that it ended up becoming. Compared to the city of Smyrna, Thyatira was very blue collar. A lot of working going on. And their patron god was Tyrannus. Tyrannus was a son of Zeus. Zeus was what to the Greco-Roman religion? The supreme God. He was the God of gods, the King of the kings. That's who Zeus was. Jesus will play against that here in a moment. And images of him shows him no clothes on, sitting on a horse with a battle axe. Verse 18. Look how Jesus starts this letter. The Son of God. Tyrannus was their patron god. Tyrannus was the son of Zeus, who was the God of gods. So right out of the gate, Jesus is not holding back. And he says, the Son of God who has eyes like a flame of fire. Are you seeing the furnaces? Those furnaces would have been bellowing smoke day and night. They would have been working on these. You would have seen the workers in their areas covered in soot and ashes and everything else. And his feet are like burnished bronze. That is how they would refine the bronze. They would put it in the fire. They'd put it in the heat. You can see this as play not only against Tyrannus, the son of Zeus, but also towards the bronzesmiths and their forges. The fire constantly raging. And he also, and also, again, you see that flame of fire, which we looked at that in chapter 1. In chapter 1, it says that he has flames of eyes that look like coals of fire or flames of fire. And we looked at fire. What does fire represent? It doesn't just mean, it can represent judgment, but what else can it represent? What do you do when you put bronze in a fire, or silver in a fire? What are you doing? You're cleaning, you're purifying, you're refining it, exactly. Verse 19, I know your deeds, love, faith, service, perseverance, and that your deeds of late are greater than at first. This is an interesting little passage that a lot of us skip over very quickly. I think, my observation, can you not hear military and work talk in that text? Your deeds, your service, your perseverance. Your deeds are greater now than they were before, so you see experience and practice at play. Not only was this city founded as a military garrison, so it had roots military-wise, but as a working place, one of the largest, longest list of guilds were found on a stone here. And it lists all these jobs that existed in the city. You had, and I put some up there, dyers, bronzesmiths, potters, stonemasons, weavers, bakers, candle makers, leather workers, woodworkers. That's just a few out of this whole list. There's many on that rock. And it's one of the largest lists of guilds ever found in this region. Which goes to show you just how big of a working town this really was. If you wanted something custom made, or you needed a job, this is where you went. You went to Thyatira. But does everybody see that language there? Or am I the only one seeing? Does everybody see that? Look at the words that Jesus uses to describe their actions, what they're doing. Do you see the military talk? Service? Perseverance? Anybody? Is it just me? Verse 20. Verse 20. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants away, so that they commit sexual immorality and eat food sacrificed to idols. We had a whole lesson on this last week. Okay? Much debate as to who this woman was. Some have said that she was a member of the church here. Some believe that, I've even seen some where they said that she perhaps could have been an overseer's wife. I don't see that at all, but I've seen that. When I do my research, I've seen that. But we must understand as well that culture plays a key role here. We can't just read this text and say, oh, well, that's probably who she was. If we don't know the cultural context, we're just guessing. We're just guessing. And we got to know our Old Testament. I said it a million times, right? So if we go back to Jezebel, because that is, Jesus calls this woman Jezebel. There's got to be something there. There's got to be a reason why she's called this. Because there weren't a lot of Jezebels running around at that time. And I said in the lesson last week, there's not a lot of Hitlers today, are there? Because the people who had those names at one point in history have ruined those names. And Jezebel and Hitler make the list, don't they? Top two, probably. Along with a few others, I'm sure. But outside the city was a shrine. And it was called a Simbate. This particular shrine was called a Simbate. And I think I spelled it. Yes. This wasn't the only one. These were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And there were these shrines where these women who claimed to be prophetess or priestess of the gods could take your request, give it to the gods, and the gods would answer through them as to what you should do. If you wanted to conjure up someone that had passed long ago, they claimed to be able to do it. If you wanted Demeter, the god of agriculture, to bless your crops, they claimed to be able to communicate with Demeter and have that happen. If you wanted to know as an emperor if you were going to lead, if you were going to win battle against the Gauls, you would go to one of these ladies and they would tell you, based on what they've heard, whether or not you should go to war with that nation. Or you should make those decisions, whatever it may be. Many of the Roman emperors believed in the oracle. These women were basically oracles. And Julius Caesar went to an oracle several times. Emperor Nero and Augustus went to these oracles several times. And what's strange is when you would go into these shrines, even though a lot of people didn't have access to get inside these smaller shrines. Now in the temples you could go in pretty good ways, but at a certain point you couldn't go any further. They would take what you wanted them to take. They would take it into this special room where this oracle would be sitting. And we talked about this last week, how the oracle was basically under the influence of some type of drug. There was one temple, and again, I think it was the Temple of Delphi, where when they built it over like this methane gas pocket. And so where she was at, she was inhaling methane. That's not safe. And yeah, it would do wonders to your brain, wouldn't it? You'd be seeing a lot of different stuff. And so they found ways to put their oracles under the influence. And so this was a popular thing. And so what they would do, I talked about this in the sermon last week, but it would be like if I went in there, the priest would greet me at the structure, and he would say, hey, what can the oracle of, what can the prophetess of Thyatira do for you today? And I would say, well, I own a vineyard over here, and last year my produce was terrible. My grapes did poorly, they had disease, whatever. I'm hoping this year I could have a very good harvest out of it. He would say, okay, wait right here. He would go in. I would probably see smoke from the sacrifice bellowing out of the top of the shrine. And then the priest would come back and say, okay, this is what the prophetess of Thyatira has for you. Upon opening up the sacrifice to the god Dionysus, who was the god of wine, we discovered that the cow had, or that the bull, the ox, had 2 stomachs. So that means you're going to have a very bountiful harvest this year. But the prophetess also declares that you must go to a temple of Dionysus in the city of your choosing 3 times a week and worship and pay tribute to Dionysus. And what pagan practices went alongside that? The 2 things. Yep, the 2 things right there. Because temple prostitution was key. Paying tribute was key, but also eating food sacrificed to idols. And the way this would happen is they would take all these meats and these other foods, and they would pile them up on the altar, and the people would eat from it. And it was a way of fellowshipping with that God and with your other believers. Here's an example of one of the oracle. This is just a painting, but you can see on the right, you can see this woman here aided by the priest, and she looks like she's kind of out of it. Because they were out of it. And they claim to be in this supernatural realm communicating. And I put in there, why call her Jezebel? Because Jezebel was the high priestess to Ashtoreth before she became queen of Israel. And worship of Ashtoreth was the goddess of sexual fertility of man and animal. So as a high priestess, what do you think her worship insisted of? Yes. I don't think I have to say it. So it makes sense why her name is attached to this woman. Because they were bringing all the same things to the table to God's people. Because when Jezebel moves to Samaria to live with her new husband Ahab, king of Israel, what does she bring with her? Do you remember? She brings a priest with her. And they live where? In the palace. And one by one, she starts to hunt down the prophets of God to replace that belief system with her pagan ritualistic system of Baal and Ashtoreth worship. That's what she wanted. And by doing that, she was luring people away from God. And this person, whoever she was, is doing a similar thing to the church. So the name fits, is my point. Verses 21 and 22, and we'll finish up on this. I gave her time to repent, and she does not want to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her on a bed of sickness, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of her deeds. This woman is so committed this woman is so committed, it seems like she's had moments, she's had chances to turn away from what she was doing, from her practices. But she's choosing not to. We don't know why. It could have been due to the addiction. I mean, we talked about how they were on these drugs and whatnot. And that reference there, bed of sickness, that Greek word that's used there for bed is klene. It's where we get our English word recliner. And it looked like, one of these couches looked like that right there. And a lot of bad stuff would happen on these couches. They would use them for sexual immorality, and they would also use them to feast with each other. You would lay there and feast. You would just, you would engage in these practices on this couch. And you can also notice, too, that you see a reference. I didn't get there. Well, we'll get there next. Because I was hoping we'd get there. But yeah, we'll pick up with verse 23 when we come back together again. I'll be back with you the normal second Sunday of October as of right now. And so we will pick up with verse 23 and we'll finish this one up and we'll keep going through. So plenty of material to go over. Thank you for your attention.